Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Tanya Beckett. I'm a broadcaster from the BBC. I've brought with me three distinguished panellists. I'd just like to say once again, it's a great honour to be here to all of you, with all of you, ladies and gentlemen, Your Royal Highness, ministers, prime ministers. Everybody seems to be here, and it's an important time, I think, for Norway. Speaking as a news broadcaster, you know, when I was younger, we didn't talk about Norway a lot, really, perhaps in a geography lesson, just to work out where it was. But now it is again and again held up as an example of how the world should work. Of course, in my country, we're trying to navigate Brexit at the moment, and Norway is seen as an example of how to manage a relationship with the EU without being quite in it. Our problem is that we can't really manage ourselves, which is the main issue there. With Norway as well, in economics, it's seen as a very good example of how to manage an equitable and fair society, how you manage your coastal area as well, and also sustainable energy and technology. All of these areas have been held up as Norway really leading the way. Although I can just say the language doesn't work quite so well for me. That's a bit of a mystery. I don't know if we have the title of the conference or the meeting up, but if you have a look at what it is and you speak English, you can see that I swallowed hard when I saw that. I wondered if I'd turned up at the right place, but that's another story. I'll leave you to digest that. So that is how we perceive Norway. How might it be that you might be perceived in some of the fastest growing economies of the world? That's the question we are now about to answer. And as I say, I have these distinguished panellists with me. So first of all, we have with me Peggy Liu. She is the let me just get the title of this right because I get confused. The chairperson of the joint US-China collaboration on clean energy. So she's going to be telling us a bit about China. We have Arunabha Ghosh, who is the chief executive officer of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And closest to me at Natznet, Tesfay, who's the director of Africa analysis in IHS Markits. I think what it might be good to bring just in this short time that we have is a flavour of what is happening in these very fast-growing economies and what it is like to be there. So, Peggy, I'm going to start with you. We talk about China and the speed of change as if China is one country. But when we talk about change, what we probably have to understand is that it's, in a way, more than one country. And I'm just going to pick up the slide thing because I realise I've left that behind over here. Please do start.
Well, I don't know how many of you have actually been to China, but I welcome you all to visit me in Shanghai. Maybe not all at once. But, you know, what people remark when they come to Shanghai and other parts of China is that they read about the pace of change. They see pictures, but when they actually land in Jiazui and Pudong, they're in awe of how fast China has grown and how fast it's changed. And really, it's a new country every 5 years. It's practically unrecognizable every 5 years. So as business people, as politicians who are trying to understand how to deal with China, you need to understand what motivates the leaders, the consumers. What's driving China to change from carrying briefcases of cash to within 12 months just paying with your phone and scanning QR codes, no cash whatsoever. Even beggars on the streets, you scan their QR code. Right? And so if you have products that you would like to bring, whether it's salmon or eco-travel to Lofoten or you know, natural resources to China, one of the things that you need to understand is that your product offerings must be reinvented for China. But because it's a new country every 5 years, you actually have to reinvent every 5 years your business strategy. And it's very confusing, even to Chinese citizens on the ground, frankly, to keep track of all of this change. Right? You can imagine that if in 2004, when I moved to China, we had 2.5 subway lines in Shanghai. Today, we have 16 subway lines. It's the largest metro in the world, 12.5 million rides a day. Right, so what does that look like to somebody who grows up and hasn't even been on an escalator? is very confusing. So imagine the government of China, the largest problem that they have is managing this chaos of growth in a harmonious manner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the secret sauce to managing growth. But what I want to make sure that you understand is when you look at China, I know we all look alike, right? We all have, long black hair, pale, sort of pale skin. Actually, compared to you, we don't have pale skin, sorry. But but we're not, okay, 80% of us are Han, but we're not one market. We're 7 regional markets. The 3 generations are completely different because we essentially went from a black hole and no buildings whatsoever to the largest urban market in the world within 30 years. So just come with an open mind, spend a couple weeks with me in Shanghai, eat some of our food. Even if you don't like Chinese food now, you will like Chinese food when I get done with you. I promise you.
Peggy, thanks very much. Arunabha, figures out on Monday, some statistics regarding the Indian economy showed that it is now the fastest growing economy in the world. The title no longer belongs to China, not at the moment anyway. So what does growth look like in India?
Well, you can actually ask the Honourable Prime Minister here, since she's just come back from India. I'm actually glad I'm getting to speak before her because she will reveal all the secrets that I would never dare to kind of articulate better than her. But here's the story. If China changes every 5 years, India takes a little longer, maybe every 7 years or every 10 years. But it is now the world's fastest growing major economy and also has been for a long time the world's largest democracy. So what is going to drive this big shift in the second largest country on the planet? And I would say the simple mantra that India has over the next few decades is a grand bargain for sustainable growth. That can we bet on sustainability to drive the growth for the economy, billions of jobs, while doing it in a way that is equitable. And the 3 big drivers for that are going to be, number 1, I would call green industrialization. If we are a $2.8 trillion economy now, going to about $5 trillion over the next 10 to 15 years, could 30 or 40% of that additional growth come from more efficient industrialization, lower carbon industrialization, manufacturing steel using hydrogen, using millions of small, medium enterprises to drive resource efficiency and drive jobs growth. The second big driver is going to be urbanization. This is a country on the move. If hundreds of millions of people have already moved into the cities in China, hundreds of millions of Indians are moving into the cities in India. So what that means is that over the next 15 years, the amount of built infrastructure that you will see in 2030, 2035, about 70% of that has not even been built yet. So how are you going to make efficient buildings? How are you going to have some of the world's largest metro railways? How are you going to cool down a hot country? You don't have a problem with the cold here, but how are you going to cool down a hot country where air conditioner demand is going to grow to 45 million units, 11-fold growth? All that is going to come from efficient use of resources and technologies. And the third big driver is going to be what I call inclusion. And what I mean by that is that we can't drive a democratic, sustainable growth model without including the majority of the population still in the rural areas. But even there, sustainability is going to be a driver. India already has one of the world's largest markets of renewable energy. But guess what? Have you heard of something called a solar irrigation pump? We've deployed more than 350,000 solar-based irrigation pumps, which are going to grow to nearly 3 million such irrigation pumps to drive our agricultural growth using clean energy. We have the world's largest program on natural farming to eliminate pesticides and fertilizers. So to summarize, green industrialization, sustainable urbanization, and the inclusion of the rural economy, those are going to strike that grand bargain for sustainable growth for the world's largest democracy and, at least for now, the world's fastest growing economy.
Now, Peggy and Arunabha obviously have one country to deal with. You've got 54, but the same amount of time. Natznet, tell us a little bit about how growth looks in Africa. And of course, I'm pointing to the fact that it's very diverse, obviously, but infrastructure is also a very big story, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think it's important to start with addressing negative perceptions that surround the African continent around conflict, terrorism, irregular migration. But when you take a step closer, you actually have a much more vibrant picture. As you said, it's a continent of 54 countries growing at different speeds. You have the so-called Africa Lions that have robust economic growth of over 6%. That includes Senegal, Ghana, and Ethiopia. And you even have the largest economies showing encouraging signs of recovery, like Angola and Nigeria. So what's driving this? What's driving it is greater political commitment to transformation through diversification and industrialization. African countries are committed to moving away from being a raw commodity exporter to being able to consume and export locally manufactured goods. And governments are offering incentives to any interested investors who want to process local natural resources. They're also promoting Made in Africa in order to move away from import dependency. Quite tellingly, the Nigerian president said recently that Africa's largest economy shouldn't have to import basic goods like toothpicks and tomato paste. And they're also trying to make sure that it's inclusive. So they're trying to ensure through local content policies that SMEs are able to ride on this wave as well. But what's missing, quite critically, is hard infrastructure. They've put a lot of effort into the soft infrastructure and regulation, but hard infrastructure is still what's the highest cost or highest obstacle for firms operating in the region today. They cite high transport and unreliable power as particularly troubling. And while we see a lot of Chinese investment in this space, that's almost a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed. It's estimated that over $130 billion is needed annually in order to close that infrastructure gap. So there are plenty more opportunities for interested investors, including Norwegians. The last thing I would highlight is Africa's desire to leverage new technology and leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution. And we've seen that they've been able to do this in the telecom sector. So that is a strong indication of the commitment and what it can deliver on. We've already seen that countries like Rwanda are the first in the world to deploy drone regulation so that they can deliver urgent medical supplies to remote areas. Other countries are leveraging blockchain in order to roll out off-grid power solutions to the 60% of sub-Saharan Africans who don't currently have access. So these are encouraging signs of what the growth potential in Africa looks like if you take a step closer and look beyond the negative images that are commonly portrayed.
Peggy, we read a lot about the Chinese government and the intentions of the Chinese government. So managing growth is important. How would you characterize how the government is trying to do that?
You know, one of the funniest things that I read outside China is that China's trying to take over the world. They're trying to take over somebody's markets, et cetera. But, you know, honestly, from within China, they're busy enough just managing the growth within, right, the domestic markets. So I think Xi Jinping probably has the hardest job in the world, just managing the change that 1.4 billion people have to deal with every day. But they do have a secret sauce. And I think that secret sauce, you know, living and born and raised in the US and now living and working in China, I compare the two countries a lot. And, you know, I see that the Chinese government, especially under the Hu administration, was all engineers. I've trained 1,000 mayors and central government officials myself on how to build cities, and I see them. They're all engineers and master's degrees. Today, there's now engineers and economists, so I call it a techonomist-led government. So think about who's leading the country. It's not comedians and bartenders and lawyers, right? It's people who are looking very long-term. They're thinking about, how do I solve this as a complex system? How do I look abroad for, like in Norway, for the best practices, the best hardware and software services, and bring them to China to integrate into this complex system? They have 1,000-person programs many times over, paying people with PhDs for the top industries to come and work in China. So they're actively looking to recruit top talent. So really, I think one of the misunderstandings is that China is a communist country, right? I think when people say that, they're thinking, you know, Russian-style communism or maybe old Germany-style communism. But actually, you know, one of the people in the Ministry of Finance once told me He went to Stanford for his MBA. He speaks perfect English. He said, you know, China actually runs like a multinational corporation, right? So there's a CEO, there's a COO, they have a board, they have local, regional heads of departments, right? It's like GE or IBM, right? In fact, they have an HR department, and this HR department has mandatory government training. So if you're a mayor, if you're a prime minister, you have to take 12 days minimum of training each year at one of the 8 government academies. I happen to be a professor at the China Academy of Governance. That's the leading one. And then I also lecture at the National Academy of Mayors in China, the China Executive Leadership Academy of Pudong. This is really, well, they told me that this is the secret to harmonious growth. So imagine if you're rolling out new policies and new sustainable solutions at city scale constantly. How do you actually do that in an even way? It's through this training, right? So if you go to China and you look at them through this lens versus like an autocratic government, you know, sort of a scary, all dressed in black, all dyed black hair, you know, don't look at them that way. Look at them like executives from IBM. It's much simpler.
Okay, so that's the government model in China. What about in India?
Well, Tanya, how do you manage a country of more than 1 billion people with 18 languages in the constitution, 1,600 dialects, some of the world's largest religions, 29 provinces? The answer is you don't. You don't manage it, you enable it.
Right.
India can't be governed top-down. India can only be governed bottom-up through an enabling mechanism that has at its core a very simple metric: equity. Are all policies, is all governance, however inefficient, however ineffective, does it have equity embedded in it? And when you combine that motivation with technology, for instance, now, almost every citizen in India has their biometrics embedded in the government database. If you combine that with financial innovation, financial inclusion, hundreds of millions of people getting bank accounts within a matter of 1 or 2 years, and if you combine that with direct delivery of benefits, so you're trying to cut out the middleman, that's what has enabled for a rapid increase in energy access, for instance. A rapid increase in housing for all, a rapid increase in access to clean sanitation, right? Unless we are able to do those things, unless people are able to see a direct connect to their day-to-day living, the grander game of industrialization, urbanization, etc., does not find resonance. But if you can do that, then you're enabling millions of entrepreneurs, billions of entrepreneurs to try and develop new business models for energy delivery, develop new business models for managing the supply chain in agriculture. The second largest hotel chain in the world is Indian, started by a guy who's now 25 and he was 19 when he started it. Wow. Right? My elder brother was 25 when he first entered an airport. He was 33 when he took over a nascent airline and built it into the largest airline in South Asia within a decade. Right? This is the kind of real opportunity that India offers if you create enabling conditions.
This extraordinary mentality that we've been hearing about is, of course, replicated in certainly parts of Africa that I've been to, and you mentioned leapfrogging there. What about attempts by governments within Africa to manage the speed of change? What is their attitude towards it?
Their attitude, I suppose, unlike Europe, is to look towards regional integration. So in the middle of last year, we had 49 African countries come together and sign an agreement towards moving towards a single market. And that is quite forward-looking because they realize if they want to grow industry, Africa currently trades more with the rest of the world than they do with themselves. So there's an opportunity to tap into these markets. But also they're trying to take advantage of upcoming trends like nearshoring, where manufacturers are moving closer to their end markets. And if you look at the African market and consumption potential, it's expected to grow to about 1.2 trillion by 2025. So they have an untapped market which they can access and achieving economies of scale. And with this integration, you also have the opportunity as a foreign investor to perhaps enter markets that are more comfortable, that have more enabling environments, like the ones I mentioned, the 12 fastest growing on the continent, in order to access the wider potential that you have across the 54 states. So they're looking at how do you grow together in a more coordinated fashion.
And infrastructure plays into that, of course, because I'm thinking of infrastructure going from east to west in Africa to reach into those markets. It plays to that theme, doesn't it?
It does. You have airlines that are taking advantage of that, like Ethiopian Airlines, which is now allowing Africans to be able to travel from one country to the other without having to transit through Europe. It's also trying to create interconnected railway lines across neighboring countries, as well as I said in Rwanda, using drones for delivery of certain goods. So they're leveraging anything at their disposal at this moment.
So we have something like just less than 8.5 minutes left. Peggy, I'm going to come to you again and ask, for this audience out there that is looking to pitch not just the Norway brand, but your individual brands too, and also perhaps just looking to set up business links with people in China, some advice as to how you might go about doing that, the to-do lists.
I'll give two very practical tips. I know China can be very intimidating. Right? Again, the citizens even have a hard time understanding the pace of change, but it's worth it. Because imagine 800 million consumers who all want to see the Northern Lights in Tromsø, or, try to fish for Arctic cod in Lofoten, or maybe have wedding pictures on the hills there, or see the Western fjords in Hurtigruten, right? All things which I've done, and I know that 800 million people want to do the same thing. So, two very practical tips. One is that China's culture is very, very different than the West. I know Europe is a little bit more similar, but the US culture, for example, is 180-degree opposite. I remember when I was teaching I was doing a lot of dinners while teaching mayors, and they are very careful to make sure that you know the title and the names exactly of every single person is very important, and where they sit. So imagine my shock when I discovered that Crown Prince Haakon doesn't have a last name. I was like, what? What kind of, how do I deal with this? Imagine my shock when a Denmark CEO came with his delegation to Shanghai. And I got there early, I sat down at the table, and I sat down exactly where I was supposed to sit. And a Chinese person came in, then the rest of the people sat down, and it took me 15 minutes to realize who the CEO was because he wasn't seated in the right place. So very little minor things, cultural differences will trip up your efforts to do business in China. So the first practical tip is get a cultural translator. The second tip is that I know that everybody talks about business networking is important, right? The old boys network, for example, legacy networks are very important. In China, you might have heard of this term guanxi. It's much, much more important to spend face time with people. Because if you're a tall poppy in China, especially right now, you might get cut down, right? So if you're truly powerful, the more powerful you are, the less you talk about the power. And so that must mean that I'm actually very, I have very little power because I talk about it all the time. But so it's very important that you spend face time understanding how to wind your way through this murky maze of decision makers. Because if you can find that one decision maker, you can change China. I've done this many times just by, for example, finding the 2 people in China's state grid to surround with experts from around the world to basically have China, within 2.5 years, commit $7.2 billion to invest in rolling out smart grid. So all I had to do was figure out who the 2 decision makers were in the entire country. So that means drinking lessons. I'm happy to teach you. I know you can drink.
Happy to learn, right?
It's just how you drink. It's not how much you can drink. Okay, let me just.
Oh, shame.
Yeah. So these types of things are very important. 2 practical tips. But if you can figure that out, then I know that there's a market for Norwegian products and services in China.
Peggy, thank you very much. Arunabha, I'll come to you as well. My experience of doing business with India is that people are very open and very friendly. That's a sort of British perception. Maybe underneath they're thinking, yes, and we're going to kill you. I don't know. Because I am British, I don't know. Well, how would you say culturally it's like doing business?
We never think that.
Well,
Number one, especially if you bring your money to us. You have Norway has the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. You know, our doors are open. I'm sure you've heard this, Prime Minister, in the last few days. That fund has invested so far about $12 billion in India. We want a lot more of that. But more seriously, what that does is it actually helps to crowd in the regular investment, right? When you're willing to take some risks, some bets on the world's fastest emerging economy, then institutional investment crowds in real foreign direct investment. The second area where I would say there is massive greenfield opportunities, where you don't have to figure out the messy morass of how to do business, is in green transportation. And I mean, you are the world's leader in per capita terms in terms of green transportation. India is, again, open for business on that account. And the third area, and I know this would be particularly of interest to you, the oceans, right? We have more than 6,000 kilometers of coastline. How we manage the coastline, how we manage the oceans, and how we cooperate with others is critical. I grew up in New Delhi, but I come ethnically from the east of the country. I think per capita, we eat more fish in the east than you do. But how do we sustainably farm fish in India versus in Norway? How do we sustainably manage our coastlines? How do we look at the role of the oceans in dealing with climate change? So I think there are clear opportunities where you have a competitive advantage. But starts with bring in your money.
Thank you. Natznet.
I would say the first thing to start with is due diligence. It's a continent of 54 different countries, political systems, and the patchwork only becomes more complicated within these countries as they have hundreds of languages and cultures within them. So it's important to do due diligence and understand what is the local business culture, much like Peggy had said, but also what are the potential risks in operating in that environment? Because oftentimes those risks can be mitigated based on how you structure your project, who you decide to partner with. You can do successful business within Africa. There are over 400 companies in Africa with an annual turnover of over $1 billion, even more when you're looking at over $500 million. So there are success stories, and you can be a part of that as well. But it's important to understand what markets you're entering into, how, and with whom, and that will make it all the more risk resilient.
So we're coming to a close. I'm going to run out of time here, but just to draw some points, it seems to me that within China, Peggy, what you're saying is that this is a very fast-moving market, and indeed it's not one market, it is many. In India, what you're saying really is that the population is very much enabled, very entrepreneurial, as of course it is in China, but different government approach, certainly, and look very much at transport infrastructure and green transport infrastructure. Not the first time I've heard that. In Africa, too, you see this very, very strong evidence of what Natznet is describing as leapfrogging, this technology leapfrogging, that you are suddenly surprised that you see something because, of course, the intermittent or the intervening, the intermediate even, technologies are missing. They've straight away moved to the more sophisticated technology. Three very exciting markets there, three very exciting people, and 46 seconds in which to tell you my Donald Trump story, which was when I lived in New York and was working for the BBC. I interviewed Donald Trump on 2 occasions. And on the first occasion, I had been briefed that I had to look at what was happening with his hair. That was the most important thing, right? Because I quickly realised that actually it was sort of woven and all flicked back and stuff, and that he'd gone through, I heard a story that he'd gone through a revolving door and everything, the whole thing had just taken off as one unit and then come into land. Anyway, after the interview, which we did in front of, would you believe, a room with mirrors in. It's very complicated to film with mirrors in the room, unless you're filming another kind of movie, but we won't get into that. And then, and he said to me, do you know, you have some grey hairs on your head and you need to sort them out. Can you imagine? So that's why I like being around Norwegian diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our guests. Thank you.